Hey everybody, welcome to Fighting Matters. I'm Steve Kwan from BJJ Mental Models. I got my boy, Jesse Walker from Rough Hands BJJ in Louisville, Kentucky. Jesse, sir, how's it going, man?
Hey, what's up everybody? Glad to be here.
Always glad to have you, man. And we've got a newbie. We've got Andrew Burcham on the line. Andrew, how are you doing, sir?
Fantastic. Thanks for having me, guys.
So we got a cool topic here today, but this kind of all hinges upon Andrew. So probably best, Andrew, to let you introduce yourself, because Jesse and I are the dumb ones here. You're the one who's going to actually have the answers. So our job is to queue up real stupid questions for you.
Yeah, just keep them simple, and as long as you don't mind me cussing, I'm good. Yeah.
Go for it. So why don't you just give everyone a quick intro so they know who we're talking to today?
So my name's Andrew Burcham. I'm an attorney and mediator. Been doing jiu-jitsu for the last 13 years. Actually started jiu-jitsu in law school as a way to clear my head. I'm also, it turns out, convenient that I'm half Canadian. So Steve and I are half, on the same page here. I'm the legal expert that fills that role for you all, and I'm pretty happy to be here. I would say, I would not say I'm an expert in any means, and I would caution to say I'm the smartest guy in the room anywhere. But I'm glad to answer any questions. Just as long as everybody realizes this, I'm not providing anybody legal advice. Just having a discussion with two of my buddies, and we're good for that. So.
Yep, sounds good. So I guess that's probably as good an opening as any. I mean, this episode should not constitute any form of legal advice whatsoever. But I did want to talk to someone who's got some experience in the space here. Now, the backstory on this, and in terms of where Jesse and I are coming from and why we wanted to have this chat. So something I've observed a lot, really across the world today, but specifically relevant to fight sports, is this use of free speech as an argument to say and do things without consequence. So the example that comes to mind for me is not that long ago, Bryce Mitchell went on this big tirade, basically talking about how, I don't even want to get into it, but basically supporting certain Nazi beliefs. And Dana White, his boss at the UFC, called him out on that. For those who don't know, Bryce Mitchell is a very controversial UFC fighter. And Dana basically came out and, condemned everything he said. Actually gave a pretty good speech about how it's not at all acceptable to support Hitler or to downplay the Holocaust or anything like that. And then I believe a reporter asked Dana, well, if this is all so bad and you agree it's bad, is Bryce going to suffer any consequences for this? And Dana just shrugged his shoulders and said, free speech, can't do it. And that's a very similar thing that you hear across the board in the combat sports. Gordon Ryan has used the same thing. He's, defended people's abilities to, espouse some pretty awful stuff under the guise of free speech. And we see this in the comments quite a bit. I mean, Jesse and I can attest to it. Every once in a while we get crappy comments that really offer nothing. And, if someone is just name calling or they're throwing up misinformation or they're trying to start crap, normally we just delete them. And we'll often get people saying, you're infringing on our free speech rights by doing this. And it really occurs to me that free speech has kind of become a blanket excuse for people to sort of say and do whatever they want without consequences. And I think it's important for everyone to really understand what free speech actually means. And there's a few different slants we can take on this. Of course, the most relevant probably for much of our audience is the First Amendment in the United States. But it's worth mentioning that I sometimes feel like I have to explain this to my American friends. The First Amendment only applies to America, right? That's not to say America is the only country with free speech, but it's structured differently elsewhere. So, for example, as a Canadian myself, we have free speech, but we don't have a First Amendment. It's documented differently, and it's 90% the same, but there are a few key differences. So I thought, Andrew, maybe where we could start with this is just a quick explanation of what actually is the First Amendment. What does it actually protect people from? What rights does it grant them? And where does the line get drawn?
In the most basic and the easiest terms to think about this is that it protects individuals and their freedom of speech, freedom of press, their freedom of religion from government infringement. It has nothing to do with a private company, private individuals, nothing like that. So, for example, the example you used, Dana White absolutely could have punished Bryce Mitchell. It has nothing to do with his free speech, right? He's an employer. an employer can punish you for saying inappropriate things. That is completely okay across the board. But if, say, the government, or I'm not sure where Bryce Mitchell's from, like Arkansas or some, some place like that, it's completely if the state he lived in said you can't espouse hate speech, and then they tried to punish him because he said those things, then there's a First Amendment and a free speech issue. But as a private citizen in a private company, Dana was well within his rights and probably morally capable of doing that.
So I guess the point that I'm getting at, and again, this is, for now, we're just talking about the United States, right? Free speech then basically means whether the government can control your ability to criticize them effectively. I think that's the way that most people would understand it, right? It's criticism towards the government. Does it go beyond that? For example, can you really say or do, like, can the government enforce anything or not enforce anything unrelated to the government? Or is free speech specifically about your ability to criticize the government?
No, it goes far beyond that. And there's it's an onion. There's different layers and different paths you can take about it. But like, there's your freedom of expression, where you can say these things, defining what free speech entails. We're fighting who's entitled to free speech. Most recently in the United States, there's been, I think there's a very, very prominent case in Colorado, a cake maker refusing to make a cake for a LGBTQ plus couple. The Supreme Court recently came out and said that it's a freedom of religion case. It was within their refusal to make that cake is protected by the First Amendment, because Colorado had a law that prohibited companies or private businesses from discriminating against this protected class. But the government, the Supreme Court said that law was unconstitutional because it infringed on the cake makers' right to express their religion. So it's not necessarily. It's actually a pretty small portion of it relates to criticizing the government. It's the government's. It's not criticizing the government as much as it is the government limiting what you can say and where you can say it. So
got it. Okay, so in this case, because I did hear about that, I heard about this cake maker situation. The real challenge then, and I guess the controversial point, and this is where law gets really interesting, right? There's a lot of laws that sound completely sensible on their face, but you can always find these weird edge cases where two laws intersect, and it actually gets quite complicated. And the cake maker one is an interesting one, right? Because this comes down to any situation where you've got like a business, and what does a business have the right to discriminate against people that they don't like? The challenge, of course, with anything like this is, I would much prefer if businesses could not discriminate. But on the other hand, now you have a government coming in and compelling people to do things that they might not want to do. And that makes it murky, right? And this is where a lot of these laws get kind of interesting, where you get two things that intersect, and sometimes the answer is nuanced or complicated, or maybe it might not make you really feel good in terms of what gets decided. What is the current state of that situation in Colorado? Because I remember hearing about this, and I thought it was kind of an interesting test case for something like this.
It's actually far more interesting than it sounds on its face, because it was promoted by, it's been decided by the Supreme Court that it was within the individual cake makers' religious, rights of the First Amendment to refuse that. Their religion, their belief said, LGBTQ plus couples are wrong or not, it's against their practice of faith or whatever. So in practicing their faith, not endorsing it by making a cake was within their rights. The Colorado law, it was very narrowly tailored. The Colorado law infringed upon that, so it invalidated the Colorado law. And then, so it's been resolved with that. It was within the cake maker's rights to deny them that service. I would encourage everybody to look into that case, because there's a lot of, and this happens a lot in the Supreme Court in the United States. There's a lot of backstory to that. And there's a similar case, I'm not sure what state it's out of, that involved a website designer. The website designer refused, I think, a gay couple from making a website for their wedding. Well, and the courts ruled that that was within their rights as well. But here's the interesting fact is that that person wasn't actually a web designer. They just, hey, they thought they might want to be one day. So hypothetically, well, if I, this happens a lot. There's groups that are backing these cases, promoting them to promote a religious or political agenda, and that's where the conflict arises. Because I'm as much as some people might not believe this about me that know me well, I'm a true believer in the justice system, and I'm a true believer in our Constitution and our Bill of Rights. That people, I think there's good here. I think there's good everywhere, and I tend to think people are doing the right thing and trusting and having similar and positive morals. But the problem arises when one group thinks that there's, just because one person has rights, it's automatically taking rights away from them. And I realize I'm talking with my hands and no one can see them, so I just look like I'm crazy. And I might be, but so that is where a lot of these conflicts come from. Is that if it was a true freedom of expression or freedom of religion, then every religion's allowed. I mean, you got to accept everybody. You can't just be promoting the 10 Commandments on a classroom wall. You got to allow Islamic believers to put their stuff up there. You got to allow Satanists to put their stuff up there. Like that's how that works. If you're going to allow one, you got to allow them all. But that's not how it happens in practice, and that's how it's not happening. And I think some southern states have just made that a law that you put 10 Commandments in classrooms, which I think is wrong. I don't believe that should be the case. But I'm again not impugning anyone's expression of their religion or their faith. But if we're going to be neutral, then we're not going to have the government's not allowed to endorse a certain religion, then they can't. Christianity's included. It's just the way it is.
Yeah, that's where free speech gets really interesting. Is when it's one thing to tell people, hey, you can say whatever you want. You have freedom of expression. But it's another thing when your beliefs compel someone else to do something, and should that be allowed? And so the 10 Commandments in schools is a great example. I mean, obviously, everyone should have the right to freedom of worship, but compelling a school to promote a particular religion, one favored over others, seems unjust. But that said, though, we're in an area now where the law is unfortunately increasingly weaponized by groups with deep pockets. You brought up that really interesting example. I don't remember the specifics, but my background is technology, so I was familiar with that case of the web designer who wanted to refuse service to a customer based on their beliefs. And you brought up that, in this particular case, that person was not actually a web designer doing any work on this front. It was a theoretical.
There was no customer either.
Yes.
It was a hypothetical case.
It was a completely theoretical case of like a hypothetical web designer wanting to serve a hypothetical customer. There was no grievance here, really. However, some of these dark money shadow organizations decided to use this as an opportunity to weaponize some lawfare, and to basically try to create or to concoct a precedent or a situation to say that, hey, in the future, we close the door on this kind of thing so that effectively anyone anywhere could reject providing services to the LGBTQ community.
Andrew, do you have any, other than just chalking it up to a kind of corrupt and captured court, why was that person given standing? Why did that thing even make it to the Supreme Court?
I have absolutely no idea.
Okay.
I think that I think it comes down to venue shopping, finding friendly courts, friendly judges, and as a basic year one con law 1 law student, you learn about standing, and that person had not been harmed. There was no, they weren't suffering any ill will. That law wasn't affecting them in any way, except that they thought that they wanted to do one time, maybe in the future. So I think it seems academic that it shouldn't have happened or shouldn't have got where it was. But,
Yeah.
you have these organizations, and I wish I knew the name of the organization that supported it, but they file these cases all over the country, and it's kind of like a shotgun blast. One of them will hit the target. One of them will make it, and certainly with the friendly Supreme Court, they're more and more pushing, I guess, their agenda or their beliefs.
I have a question for you, Andrew. You mentioned venue shopping. Can you kind of explain how that works? Because that's I can say I've actually worked in legal before, and as a Canadian, when we interact with a lot of countries and regions around the world, it gets quite interesting. So, for example, if you have to work in the European Union, in some ways, people often understand that the EU has some laws that are much more focused on like consumer protection than you'd see in the States. The big example that comes up to my mind is data protection and privacy. So GDPR, for example, protects the data usage rights of European residents. And although it is restrictive, it's at least relatively easy to work with because it's one legal framework, and kind of if you're satisfying the GDPR, you're probably going to be mostly good in most European countries. The U.S. is very different. Almost every state can have a significantly different legal framework. So I always found it quite challenging to provide digital services to the states, because if you wanted to make sure that you satisfied, privacy laws and data protection laws, they could vary wildly from state to state. So California, for example, might have laws about, hey, are companies allowed to sell my data? Other states may not have any such law. So this is where venue shopping kind of comes into play. Can you maybe explain what that is for people and whether or why it's dangerous if it is?
Oh yeah, and this relates particularly with we're talking about free speech with the federal courts. Federal judges are appointed by the president, and they serve for a lifetime. So if, say, just for example, Donald Trump is now the president, the judge retires today in Illinois, Donald Trump would replace that judge with a person who he thinks would do a good job, I'm sure, but with a political. They look at their history, their beliefs. That obviously there's in-depth interviews and stuff, but certainly a conservative-leaning judge. And the idea, fundamentally, the justice system is based on, we have that statue that has their eyes covered. The law is blind. But the law might be blind, but judges and juries are not. We deal with people. You can predict the best you can, but it's still people, and they do crazy things. But they'll appoint a conservative leading judge, and then that may be different in California, or maybe different in New York or Florida or whatever, what the circuit they're in. Then they'll file a case we'll use Texas for example. Texas, very conservative part of the country. Typically file a case in Texas, you get a conservative judge. That conservative judge rules in your favor. They try to appeal it, and it goes up. It's a pathway. And if you pick the circuit or the appeals court you want, because the judge has similar beliefs as you do, or has a history of ruling in favor of religious freedom that matches yours, or being more lenient on appeasing religious beliefs or religious accommodations, as opposed to adhering to strictly neutrality, government neutrality. So you pick that judge because he's going to rule in your favor, or a judge is not going to. Conversely, it's not going to rule in your favor. That automatically, you're like, all right, cool, they're going to not. But the next court up, and ultimately the ultimate court in our country is 6-3 conservative now. So that's why all these cases are rushing to the Supreme Court, because they're conservative leaning, and they know that these cases are going to be decided in their particular religious beliefs, I guess.
And of course, this is frustrating because, like you said, in theory, the law is supposed to be blind. So if everything was working as intended, we shouldn't see this, a situation where suddenly there's a conservative majority on the Supreme Court. And so all of the conservatives are like, now is our time. And they're trying to pump as much stuff through to get their precedents approved. In a truly blind justice system, we shouldn't have that, right? But of course, as you pointed out, it's easy to say that justice should be blind, but justice is ultimately enforced and executed by human beings who come with our own biases and motivations. So it makes it kind of a tricky situation. And I'm sure, of course, that if you had a time machine, well, I remember this because I was there. If you have a time machine, you go back in time 20, 30 years, a lot of conservatives would complain about activist judges because their feeling at the time was that liberal judges were pushing things too far in a direction that they didn't agree with. So this is not necessarily a new thing, although I think you can very clearly make the argument that what we're dealing with right now is unprecedented in terms of the amount of activism that we're seeing out of the Supreme Court. At least that would be my take, but you tell me if I'm wrong.
I don't think you're wrong. I think that and you're certainly right with this. Stacking the court isn't a conservative creation. Both sides have done it since the history. And it's the reason we're at 9 judges now. I mean, it was new Supreme Court judges who added in order to overrule the court. That's why we discussed possibly extending the court to 11. Or when under President Biden, expanding the court to 11 to, allow him to, sway the court in the Democrat or the liberal favor or, position. So it's not a new thought, but there does seem to be a real sense of like religious connotation or religious beliefs that. I can think of a few judges that are, like Alito and Clarence Thomas, that are gone so far, they're not even adjudicating anymore. They're just
operating on vibes.
Right. And they're presenting their opinions. And also I think there's a real question of impartiality when you have justices that are getting $1 million campers from rich business owners that have cases before the court, and that's a real head scratcher for me. And certainly as a person, as whose position and job in life is a mediator, whose job is to be impartial in labor disputes. I understand what impartiality means, and getting gifts from. As a mediator for the federal government formerly, I couldn't take a slice of pizza from two parties under the fear that I would be deemed impartial. Other people are taking $40 million planes or $400 million planes and massive campers and vacations and private jet usage.
Well, maybe that's the problem. Maybe that's the problem, Andrew. Maybe you were just thinking too small. Maybe instead of going for that pizza, you should have just asked for a luxury yacht, right? Maybe the problem isn't, it's just a scale issue.
You're right. God forbid. I'm sorry for being morally pure. I should aim bigger.
Well, speaking of the recipient of said $400 million plane, there was another kind of First Amendment or free speech topic that I thought would be salient for this podcast, and it's the issue of incitement. Right? So I feel like it certainly happened a lot more last term. Eventually leading to January 6th. But this idea that, especially given now where we have these huge internet megaphones and people have tremendous sway over large swaths of people, if they continue to say, somebody ought to do something about person X or issue X, and they repeat it over and over and over again, eventually, just statistically, somebody's going to be like, you know what? I should do something about that guy. And then they go out and commit some sort of heinous crime. But given our laws and how they are interpreted and adjudicated now, there never seems to be any accountability for the original person that maybe incitement's a strong word, but in my opinion, it oftentimes tends to incite behaviors in less stable individuals.
I think this encapsulates a significant problem with our approach to free speech. I mean, that brings in, or maybe not our approach to free speech, but an unintended or unimaginable issue with how we deal with the internet and social media. I mean, you think 40 years ago, none of this existed, and if crazy guy, the crazy guy in the corner only affected the 5 people that walked past him, or everybody had that crazy uncle. Or I grew up in a tiny town in Ohio. Everybody knew the town drunk, but nobody outside our town knew him. But now that the town drunk or the town crazy guy has access to the internet, he can not only share his thoughts, he can also find thoughts that reinforce his crazy ideas. And where social media was intended to expand our worldview and allow us to meet people from across the planet, in reality, all it's done is allowed us to shrink our worldview and isolate ourselves. So that's one part of this. So I kind of got off track there, but I think that's a real issue. And as far as the incitement goes, there's actually, if you ever want to take a field trip up 71, right after you pass Cincinnati, there's the current Supreme Court case or Supreme Court test based on imminent lawless action and inciting is based on a gentleman called Brandenburg who lived in Warren County, Ohio. And if you drive up 71, his barn has a 50-foot Confederate flag painted on it to this day. So if you can drive by and see the landmark of the clear and present danger or the imminent lawless action test. And what the difference is, and it has to, like, it must incite like imminent lawless action. Like where I think people get away with, like if you're on the internet saying we should go do this or go do this, I think it's different than if you're standing on a podium or in a crowd of people saying, hey everybody, let's go burn this building down. Like that's imminent. Like you're there. It's on point. And then they also consider the likelihood of it's going to likely to produce that action. So if I'm in a crowd of 1,000 people and I'm just nobody knows who I am, and I yell, hey, let's go beat that guy up. It's imminent. It's potentially imminent, but I'm in a crowd of 1,000 people. The likelihood of somebody listening to me and following through is a lot less than somebody standing in front of that crowd or with a loudspeaker or a megaphone saying, hey, let's go beat that guy up. Then it's a whole different action. Or in this case, Brandenburg, who was a KKK leader that espoused a lot of hateful thoughts and, he actually invited a reporter from a local news station to a KKK rally and was fined and I think may have potentially jailed for a short time and then took that case before the court.
It's it's a term that I've sometimes heard described as stochastic terrorism, which is where you don't necessarily do something specifically yourself, but rather you use the platform that you have to effectively flood the zone with like messaging about someone. And maybe you don't specifically say, hey, we should go and, we should go and inflict violence upon this person, but rather you create such a negative sentiment that, as Jesse said, that out of the hundreds of thousands or millions of people who listen to you, there's going to be that one mentally ill person who decides to just pick up the ball and go with it. And that's obviously a very hard thing to deal with from a legal standpoint, because technically speaking, you haven't had one person say, hey, we should go and hurt this person, but rather you've implied it so frequently to such a wide audience that that just playing the game of numbers, one of those people is going to act on your message. Of course.
Well, we have that happen in the community. Even in our community, right? You've got somebody says just the wrong thing about Gordon Ryan, and the entire Gordon Ryan army attacks him online. right?
Yes. Yeah, I have had that happen to friends of mine where they were just posting something that they weren't even addressing Gordon, but it was something Gordon disagreed with, and he saw it, and so basically he reposted it and kind of, sort of, without saying it, sort of implied, he kind of set the vibe out there that maybe this person should be disagreed with, and that they would just get that person would just get bombarded with negative messages. Now, at the bare minimum, that in terms of how that impacts someone, it feels like I don't know if it is or not legally, but it feels like a degree of harassment. I can only imagine that at a certain scale, it can lead to much worse. So, I mean, the example that it kind of comes to mind from the legal perspective, right, if we're talking about politics, is I remember the controversy in, the first Trump election where he sort of implied that the Second Amendment people should do something about Hillary. Thankfully, nothing came of that. But even stepping aside from politics, I mean, a relevant current world example, there is I hope you guys don't know who this is, but there is a well-known influencer named Ethan Klein, who runs an organization called H3H3 Productions. Basically, he's just a guy with a massive following, but he's notorious for weaponizing his audience and kind of sicking them on people that he doesn't like. And even if one person is not making an explicit threat, when you have a platform with millions of people following you, it can lead to dangerous situations. But of course, the challenge is, I mean, I'm not really aware of any legal framework that can deal with something like this. I'm not even sure how you would. The rights that were granted to us were set in stone hundreds of years ago, and they never could have imagined a situation where some schmuck in his basement could have a following like this that he could use. Sort of like how, our Second Amendment rights never anticipated intercontinental ballistic missiles. Thankfully, we're not in a stage where randos can just own those in their houses now. But with free speech, it is the case that any individual person can create a platform that rivals or exceeds the capabilities of true media outlets. And that creates a really challenging problem when it comes to, okay, what is the reasonable limit of a person's First Amendment rights? And so, I mean, it's a complicated problem, Andrew. I don't think there's an answer, but I'd love to hear you maybe riff on that.
I think that brings up one problem, I guess, with our legal system is that it's not preventative; it's responsive. Almost always. So it's the rise of social media. While it's been a pretty, I don't know if I'd call it a slow burn, but it's kind of snuck up on everybody in the last. Certainly, exploded with COVID, with everybody sitting around doing nothing but making videos because that's all they could do. Like, the law hasn't caught up to that, and doesn't realize the impact. It may be because the people that make the laws aren't in tune with what's actually happening on social media. I think that could be a problem. But the law hasn't been able to address that, because if they have 10,000 followers, or even 10 million followers, and they say, meet me on the street corner, certainly a lot of people are going to show up. But if they say, go attack this person, I mean, there's plenty of room there to say that I didn't, wasn't imminent. They weren't promoting, it was all hypothetical. It was freedom of expression. It was satire, anything like that. There's a lot of room there for them to get out of. So the law hasn't really caught up with that. It's getting around to it, and I think that there's some states that have tried to, force or pass laws that restrict some of the things, forcing social media providers to limit or be responsible for content on their platform. I think it's not come down on the side of restricting this speech. I think the laws are, the courts are currently allowing, not holding them responsible for that. But that's where we're at. Like, it's catching up, but maybe not in the best way, or not fast enough. Just because that's just the way our system is set up. But I think this also really brings in a good place to compare the United States versus, say, Canada, because the United States is more of a wide open, we'll restrict speech as much as possible, but Canada's a balancing act. Like, it's kind of a, hey, we can restrict with free speech, but hey, for the good of the country, good of society, good of protecting people, there are restrictions. So there's a lot, Canada has the ability to restrict that hateful speech, that inciting speech, a whole lot more than the United States does.
So this is maybe a good opportunity to dig into this, where kind of the limits change from country to country, and particularly the relevant example would be, the differences between Canada and the U.S., because that's what I'm most familiar with. If you listen to folks like Joe Rogan, they will tell you that Canada is a communist, country with free speech being suppressed and people can't say what they want. As a Canadian, that has never been my lived experience, but there are definitely differences. And the main difference is that Canada, like many other countries, has hate speech laws. But it's not as simple as like you can't, fly a swastika or something. It's actually quite complicated to execute on a free speech. It is actually quite complicated to execute on a hate speech claim. And my understanding is it very rarely happens. But for the benefit of the folks in the States, could you maybe explain what these laws actually look like and say and do in countries like Canada? So yes, we have hate speech laws, but what does that actually restrict people from doing? And what are the consequences if someone were to infringe on those laws?
Like I will express as much as I am aware. I don't want to. Although I am half Canadian, I do not know the Canadian judicial system that detailed. But it's really a a reasonableness and a proportionality test. Like they can limit hate speech that's not protected, and it can be criminally prohibited. But it balances the Canadians' right to free expression versus, dignity, equality, and the safety of the people. So if you're out there, espousing, anti, racial or anti-religious, xenophobic sort of things, the government of Canada can pass laws that make that illegal, can prosecute you for that, and then that's just the way it is. But in the United States, like that sort of thing is a lot harder to criminalize, or a lot harder to prosecute. And I wish I could. I wish I could recite its charter. I wish I could tell you exactly what the law says, but I'm drawing a blank right now, so forgive me. But maybe by the end of this, I'll be able to tell you more. But I apologize.
Yeah, makes sense. It is an interesting one, too, because when this thing kind of comes up, like when you get into hate speech, most of the time when I see this in the news, it is not government enforcement, but rather it's like a private institution or a company or some sort of board that is enforcing it upon their members. I am not really aware of many situations where like the Canadian government has come in and arrested someone because of what they've said. More often it is, someone was a teacher or a doctor, and they said something that their organizing body felt was inappropriate for someone in that role, and so they took some punitive action. And that gets into the interesting topic of, how we differ between your government-granted free speech rights versus the private consequences that you may suffer as a citizen. So I hear this a lot, for example, and we'll go back to the Dana White example, right? Bryce Mitchell. He espouses that, he says he makes some pro-Hitler comments. He downplays the Holocaust. Dana White's response is, hey, he's got free speech. From a government standpoint in the States, maybe he does. But I think too many people now have those government obligations conflated with how private companies or public companies as well, but how other organizations might interact with those rights. I mean, yes, it's true that the government isn't going to round you up for, saying something that might be considered hateful in the States, but that doesn't prohibit companies or organizations from deciding they don't want to associate with you because of your statements. I'd love to maybe hear you talk about that and whether there's kind of like some legal understanding of what companies can do and enforce. So, for example, when is it appropriate for a company to come in and say, hey, you as my employee or contractor, we're terminating this relationship because I don't like what you said or did. What are kind of the rights of a company or an organization in a situation like that?
I think it depends on it depends on the employment relationship. I think in most cases, unless there's a union contract or some other guaranteed protections, everyone's an at-will employee. And you can be fired or punished however the law says you can be. I mean, you can't, and as long as, and the limit to that is the, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Like if as long as they're not punishing you because you're a protected class, then they're fine. Like in Bryce Mitchell's case, his statements were offensive to a majority of the planet. I would hazard to guess. I would feel confident in saying that they were not appropriate to most people listening. Well, that paints the company in a negative light. As a representative of the company, they have a right to say, hey, you've represented us badly. We no longer want your services. Of course, now if he was an independent contractor or have a certain contractual relationship that said, hey, like there's no morality clause, or said, hey, no matter, if he had a clause in his contract that said, no matter what I do, you can't fire me. I could murder somebody on live TV, but I can't be fired. It was a contractual, I mean, that's an extreme example, obviously. But if that contractual relationship said they had to still keep him on the rolls, then that would dictate that. And obviously there's ways to get around that, but there, as an extreme example here. So that relationship defines that. If there was a union contract, that would, like say the MLB, for example, it's a professional sport, has a collective bargaining agreement, dictates discipline and how people can be, defines the employment relationship. If that had a morality clause, or said, hey, if you go on TV and say racist, xenophobic, all sorts of, those negative comments, then we can fire you, then that would define that. But as long as it wasn't because if he wasn't disciplined based on his race, his age, his gender, his, there's a litany of things that, protected statuses.
And that's what makes situations like the cake maker difficult, right? Is because you kind of have the confluence of two protected classes. You have sexual preference or gender, and then you have religion. And so you have two protected classes fighting against each other. It would be a lot easier, I presume, if it was not like that. If you were discriminating against someone because they didn't like the television sitcom Seinfeld, I presume that's a much more cut and dry situation than if it's something related to religion, because that's obviously its own protected class as well, and that's what makes it murky, correct?
Absolutely. And I think the problem is that there's the religion in this area has been, I don't saying it weaponized is probably too harsh, but it's the belief that because someone is gay or lesbian or trans or something like that is somehow affecting how you believe. That creates that problem, and I don't. My personal belief is that that's not right. That's just because you want to believe a certain way doesn't mean this person isn't allowed to live their life. I grew up in a Catholic family, but I am at this point in my life, I don't know anywhere in the Bible where it says not to love somebody, and not to, so not to get off topic, but I don't. It's the weaponization of those beliefs, or the conflation that because that person is who they are, that somehow affects your right to believe or practice how you want. And making cakes is somehow an extension of that. Or designing web pages is somehow an extension of that, which...
Well, I believe it was Jesus Christ who once said that, he who does not build a website for someone else of the belief that, Jesus, the web designer, I believe, he had very strong stances.
Well, but we've seen this taken to some potentially really dark places, right? So at least in the States, we have a very broad definition as per the Supreme Court about what speech is, right? So we've even seen cases where physicians refuse treating patients over religious objections. So now it's getting to, as a physician, their ability to practice medicine and provide health care to this person is now considered a speech act. which I think is a really interesting interpretation of the First Amendment and free speech in general.
And I think that's the trend of the Supreme Court now, as opposed to enforcing neutrality in what had been the way of the court, prior to the last, prior to 2020, I would say that had been, well, not always, but that had been the predominant thought is neutrality. We're not going to promote, we're not going to criticize, we're not going to limit, whatever. But now it's become a more accommodating. They're trying to accommodate religious expression as opposed to keeping them separate. And that's causing the problems is the accommodation. And that combined with limiting, not accommodating everybody, which I think is where this breaks down. Like which will ultimately cause a problem because you can't accommodate everybody. Like, and there's some things we don't want to accommodate. Like hate speech. If you're hateful, you don't want to do that. That's not productive for society. But at the same time, the way our laws are written, hey, we got to take the good with the bad.
Yeah. I think the argument to be made, of course, is that if you is the old slippery slope argument. If you start shutting down hate speech, well, who defines what hate speech is, and how can that get weaponized against you? I mean, I honestly, I think that's an overblown concern, but I do admit that it's theoretically possible that could be hijacked. It does get interesting, though. I mean, you talked about, so often religion is used as the free speech example. That is kind of the basis for how a lot of these legal challenges get put forth. And it's tricky because, people can believe anything they want, regardless of what, religious framework they follow. You can interpret anything you want. And so religion can basically be anything you want it to be. And there are extremists out there whose religious beliefs entail suppressing other people based on protected class. And that creates a really interesting challenge. If someone's stated religious beliefs are that another group of people should not exist or should not have rights, that's really challenging. And that's where I think you see a lot of these issues. And I think that's probably why so often when, lawfare happens, when the law is weaponized to try to get something through, so often it ties to a religious basis because anyone can make any religious claim they want. I mean, you can say, hey, my belief is this. Anyone can say that. You don't have to. Not everyone who, for example, is a Christian or a Muslim believes the exact same thing. So it's very easy to just assert a religious belief on something. And that's where I think the gray area for a lot of these things come up, no?
Oh, where do we stand on stoning adulterers? Is that...
Well, that's an interesting example, right? Like if you want to
depends on which book you read.
Yeah, if you want to get real medieval, right? Like if you are going to follow the Quran or the Bible literally, I mean, you could very easily get into a situation where you've got a confluence of two laws conflicting with each other, right? On one hand, one person's freedom of expression, but their freedom of expression could directly result in the harms or suppression of somebody else. And so how do we deal with that, and where is the line? I presume, Andrew, that's where the big challenge lies, huh?
Yeah, I mean, because it absolutely does, and but I think that's a problem that is more significant than it should be. I mean, because I truly believe that just because one person has rights doesn't take away the rights of somebody else necessarily. Like just because we used, not to get off topic, but used the gay marriage thing. Just because you're allowing two dudes that love each other to get married doesn't mean my marriage to my wife is any less special, any less important. I don't like those two things are not problems. But some people think they are. And, like making a cake for a gay couple. That doesn't, I mean, you still get to go to church. You're not promoting it. You're charging them. Like if you gave it to them for free, I could say, hey, I could see in a religious connotation, you're promoting or endorsing.
Or if you were forced to put it on your social media or something, right?
Right. So, and it absolutely is where that comes from, like that conflict. And I don't think it's as big a deal as people make it out to be, or I don't think it should be as big a deal. People make it out to be. Yeah. But you also, I think this is where the social media and the free exchange of information has changed the way we approach these things, because you can say you have a crazy thought, like maybe even myself, if I had a crazy idea. I mean, there's about limitless things on the internet now. I could find somebody that supports that, or I can get people to support that, and it reinforces it and makes it less wrong. Because I believe, people say that, racism is dead, or used to not be a problem, but now it is, or it's becoming back, whatever. I mean, I think there's always been hateful people wherever we are. It's always going to exist. There's always going to be people that have those thoughts. But now those people can share it a lot faster and get that reinforcement a lot faster. So it's causing these problems to be, or at least seem, much bigger. And then if you want to fight, I mean, there's very few of us on this planet that are willing to stand up by themselves and stand up for something just by yourself. So if you have an idea that you're not brave enough to promote yourself, but if you get your 100 friends that are following you on Instagram to support you, then it makes a whole lot less scarier. It takes a lot less courage than it would to singularly stand up for that idea.
Yeah, makes sense. Something I want to ask here and get your perspective on, Citizens United. That's an interesting one because, I mean, maybe you can explain it better than me. Do you want to talk a bit about what that is and what the implications of it are? I mean, this is a very American-centric thing, but I think you could argue that a lot of the problems that seem to have accelerated over the last few years could kind of be directly attributed back to that. But I want to get your perspective on this.
I think that is probably the single greatest or single most consequential Supreme Court decision. I mean, it ranks in there in the top 10 of all time. Certainly, probably the most important politically or societally in the last 20 years. What that case said simply was that it, in the most basic terms, treats corporations as individuals, and because of that, they have a right to free speech or free expression and can't be restricted in political contributions. And so what that did was allow big money from corporations to create their own political action committees, PACs, and super PACs that can now pour money into political campaigns. Like, clearest example, like, we wouldn't have an Elon Musk problem this year if it wasn't for Citizens United. And what it is allowing is corporations to support politicians and get them elected, and then those politicians are becoming beholden to these corporations, and is allowing companies to influence law and society and how our country is governed way more than they ever would have in the tens and the 90s and 80s and previous to Citizens United.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I was listening to a podcast or an interview a while back, and they were talking about some of the the crypto bros, right? And basically, you've got a bunch of honestly kind of borderline imbeciles in some case who just bought a bunch of crypto and wound up becoming billionaires overnight because they bought Doge at the right time or Dogecoin at the right time or whatever. And so now you've got a lot of these like very, a lot of new money, a lot of very young people who suddenly became multi-billionaires and they've got all of this money to spend. And I heard a comment from one of them or someone saying something to the effect of, when they looked into it, their surprise was not that you can buy government access or that you can buy government influence. Their surprise was how cheap it is, right? I mean, think about Elon Musk, right? How much money did he put into the Trump campaign? Like 140, 150 million or something? Drop in the bucket.
I thought it was like 240. I thought it was like 240
something like that.
million.
But like for him, a drop in the bucket, right? And I mean, you look at like these people who are like Zuckerberg or Bezos, donating $1 million to Trump's inauguration. That's nothing to these people, right? The fact that they can swing that much influence out of the government for that little money is shocking and embarrassing. And to your point, this used to be something that would at least be protected against. But with the Citizens United ruling, I mean, if you want to really dumb it down and simplify it, basically what that means is that money is speech now, right? A corporation can use their vast wealth to pour that into political infrastructure and influence decisions. At least there used to be barriers to that before. I mean, I'm sure it had always happened. There has always been corruption, but at least there was a barrier to it before. Now there is almost a direct pipeline for these incredibly wealthy people to just siphon their money into the government. And I mean, if you want to take a look at return on investment, I mean, God, Zuckerberg put what, $1 million into Trump's inauguration. His ROI on that has been unbelievable. Musk as well, right? He put in a bunch of money, but just in terms of all of the stock gains on his companies right after the fact, he'd immediately made way more money than he put into it, even though he put in, like you said, like a $250 million or whatever, or $1/10 of a billion or whatever it might have been.
Stupid amount.
And that's pretty wild, because I always grew up with an understanding of how investment was supposed to work, right? You're supposed to find healthy businesses that can generate a profit and you buy them at a good price. But what's really shocked me in the last year or so is that it really feels like all investment fundamentals have just been completely abandoned. I mean, everyone knows that, TrumpCoin or whatever the hell his meme coin is called is completely worthless. It's right in the terms of service that this is a shit coin. It's not worth anything. And that's why it's actually kind of hard to, hold it against Trump, because this is one thing he didn't lie about. Like it says right in the terms of service, this is a joke, basically. But because everyone knows that by putting money into it, they can influence him, it's become this incredibly high valued currency that has made billions of dollars for Trump and his family, despite the fact that its stated value is effectively zero. And the impact that has on politics and our culture is crazy. Like the fact that you've got investment firms and stuff now throwing money at companies like, well, not so much now, but a few months ago, throwing money at companies like Tesla, not because of any business fundamentals, but because they believed, well, this guy's got so much access to the president, of course his stock's going to go up. That's really fucked up and dangerous, right? Because it means that business no longer matters. It means that oligarchy is now the driving force behind capitalism, and that is really scary.
Yeah, and I think and please don't take this me as defending Trump. Trump didn't invent this problem, though. He's certainly really good at taking advantage of it. He
leveraged it, right? I mean, credit where it's due, and he has been open about that, even back to his first term. He basically said, like, look, I'm just doing what I was able to get away with, right? Yeah. I mean, I don't pay taxes because I found a way to not do it. And he is just a very visible symptom of a problem that's been there for decades.
And it's a fundamental. It fundamentally breaks down our democracy or our republic, because both sides. I mean, it creates an arms race for money. It's all instead of having single mom and pop, giving a candidate $100 to their campaign. Now you have political action committees that are raising billions of dollars. It takes it from representation of everyday citizens to representation of massive government, massive companies. And this isn't a Republican problem. This is an everybody problem. Every politician does this. Like if they tell you they don't, they're lying. They do it. And some of them may do it because they have to, because there's no other way to compete, but it does make them beholden to the companies, and it causes endless amounts of problems, inappropriate influence. You have restrictions, regulations removed, or companies get away with terrible things because politicians are looking the other way. Purdue Pharma, but it's a real problem. I'm from Kentucky, so it's a problem we did.
Yeah. So speaking of Kentucky, right? I mean, we are in the process of witnessing the birth of this big, beautiful bill any day now that Trump is pushing. And, there have been some wild comments from people on the Republican side about this. I mean, there was that, I can't remember who she was, but, she was confronted at a town hall about this, and she was told people are going to die. And, because of this, because of the cuts to Medicare, Medicaid, and her response was, well, we're all going to die. And, speaking of Kentucky, Mitch McConnell just the other day said, the constituents. Yeah, we're going to take away their health care, but they're going to get over it. And Andrew, that touches exactly on what you talked about, which is the danger of this. Very clearly, these politicians are not even remotely interested in serving their constituents anymore. They're interested in serving their wealthy donors, and they're not even hiding it, right? 50 years ago, the idea of doing something like this, of slashing everyone's paid into benefits that they paid for their entire lives so that you could give money to people like Elon Musk, the idea of doing that back in like the 80s would have been political suicide. But now they're not even hiding it because they don't care, because they know it doesn't matter. That the people they're really serving are their donors, which are like the super PACs and the ultra wealthy and the oligarchs.
If you look at a place and if you want a real insight on real positive spin on this, real thought, our governor Andy Bashir is wonderful at fighting this, and my representative Morgan McGarvey are also fighting against this, because you have parts of our state that the closest rural hospital might be 20 minutes away, but because these Medicaid cuts were most of these people are poor and destitute, a lot of them live off government assistance. If you cut those and cut Medicaid, because that's the only insurance they have, then that hospital's going to shut down. Then the next hospital becomes 40 minutes away. And then that hospital gets shut down. Then they have zero access to health care, and somebody has a stroke or a heart attack or some other emergency that they've got to go an hour, 2 hours to get to the nearest hospital. Like that's a real thing that will happen because of these cuts. And that is a direct relation to promoting big business and the ultra wealthy, because it's not as profitable. I mean, hospitals have become businesses. They're not there to help people anymore. I mean, you look at things. We're getting way off topic here, but BlackRock just sued United Healthcare because they helped too many people. That's insane. Like that is. I mean, I'm not a huge Star Wars guy, but if there needs to be equated evil empire shit, that's evil empire shit. Like BlackRock suing someone because they helped too many people, that's just wrong. Yeah. But anyway, I know I got a soapbox there, so I apologize.
It's great. I know we're running at about an hour. There is one thing, and I feel like it was in some ways the inspiration of this episode. Maybe it's a softball. I don't know. Why do you think in America we have such a fundamental misunderstanding of our free speech rights? And why do you think everybody equates that to just being able to say horrible shit on the internet without any repercussions whatsoever? Where do you think that came from?
Do you want the softball answer, or we could probably have another episode strictly on that question. I don't know. I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what our laws are. Like, people aren't educated, or don't follow, or don't take the extra step, or don't have the personal responsibility to know what is happening. They've been relieved of that somehow, or they don't. It's easier just to say something stupid on the internet than to actually look something up. And I don't want to sound like an old person, because I'm in my 40s, but I'm still. I think I'm young.
Don't worry, they will insult you in the comments.
Yeah.
Just wait.
Well, I grew up as a fat kid with scars and a stuttering problem, so I'm sure. And I'm a graduate of Ohio State as a Michigan fan, so nothing anybody can tell me I haven't heard already, or haven't fought my way out of a grocery store before. So, good luck. But no, I think it is a fundamental misunderstanding of what the law says. But it has become easy to say. Has always been easy to say free speech, because of this fundamental misunderstanding that they think that they can say whatever they want, and there's a lack of consequences and a lack of cultural. As misguided as it may be, a cultural independence, or a cultural, hey, I'm an American, I can say whatever I want. Where in a place like Canada, it's more of a cultural cooperation, or for the good of society, where that isn't as prevalent, or may not be as prevalent. But also as a Newfoundlander, I've also been on the receiving end of a lot of Newfie jokes. So I
bet you have.
Right. You may not know this, Jesse,
I was about to cue one up right there for you, sir.
Right. I am a Newfoundlander, so I get it. I'm not as an easy life. Like I said, I'm a fat kid with scars, stuttering problem, and a Newfoundlander, so I'm basically punching my way out of a box wherever I go. But I have legitimately fought my way out of a grocery store before. That's a story for another time. But I that's the simplest answer. I think it's no one, because there has always been a misunderstanding or this idea of independence. No one has challenged the lack of education or lack of understanding, and it's allowed to propagate to, I can say whatever I want wherever I want, even though we all know we all know the idea you can't say fire in a crowded movie theater. Everybody knows that's like a trope you learn in junior high. But no one's ever extrapolated that to you can't say hateful, stupid shit on the internet.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think there's a few reasons, Scott. I'd love to do a whole episode on internet culture and why people act the way they do online. But the big thing to me is, everyone I talk to who wants to support, like the Bryce Mitchells of the world, their argument is always, well, I'm a free speech absolutist. That's something that you hear a lot now. And I have yet to meet a person who claims they are a free speech absolutist who really actually is. Like, it sounds like a good thing to say, but when you really think through the consequences of what that means, you will find that these people always have a line. They just don't want that line to be enforced against them. They want to be able to say whatever they want to other people, but they don't want the same in return. I mean, the perfect example of this is, Elon Musk, long-stated free speech absolutist. Once he bought Twitter, that went out the door real quick, right? I mean, it turns out that he wasn't such a big fan of free speech when that guy was like posting the flight coordinates of everywhere that his personal plane went to, right? And it shouldn't take that much brain power for a lot of these people to understand that they actually don't believe the thing that they say they do. I mean, if you're a free speech absolutist, would you be like, okay with me publishing all of your bank passwords and the location of where your kid goes to school? Probably not, I would venture to guess, right? Everyone has a line. And the problem with a lot of those things, like I'm a free speech absolutist, is it sounds really good and aspirational as long as you don't think too much about it. But with anything like this, you always have to understand that every right that you're asking for, you are giving the ability for other people to use that same right against you. So you got to be real careful about that, right? I think that a lot of, like I said, I have never met a single person in my life claiming to be a free speech absolutist who would really, truly apply that same rule in the opposite direction to themselves.
Agreed.
Yep. And that's why it's hard, certainly in our country, but I think like drawing that line as for everyone, because a kid uses that balancing act, but that balancing. And I think that's a good thing, but it will always be a conflict with, the culture of the United States and how our system is set up, and it will, drawing the line wherever is always going to lead to problems with somebody. And that's the I think what a lot of people don't understand either. I truly believe our founders created the best system they could, but it's certainly not a perfect system. And I think it's certainly was never intended to be a perfect system. That's why we have amendments. That's why we've changed them 26 times. Like the Constitution's not perfect. It's just not. It never was intended to be. So, but people have that misunderstanding that it is. So we are allowed to change. We're allowed to re-examine ourselves. The balance of society 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, where we were allowed to own people. Like, that is in no way, shape, or form acceptable today. It wasn't then either, but like, that is a prime example of how culture and our understanding of how we interact with each other has changed. So we changed that law. Like, we have an amendment saying that's not allowed anymore. So use it for other.
For now.
Right. Yeah, I mean, things are starting to look pretty scary. I mean, at the rate that things are eroding, who knows what's going to happen? But yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. Speaking of that, my father as a Newfoundlander, a Canadian citizen, I asked him after all this stuff went down. I was like, hey, are you good? Like, are you anywhere concerned that you're going to get shipped back to Newfoundland? And he's like, shit. He's like, if they do, they won't have to try real hard. It's like, Like, that's true, Pop. There you go.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting thing to talk about. You know, I know that most Americans really hold their First Amendment rights very near and dear, but I'd ask people to really think about what that means. Like, I can tell you, as a Canadian right now, I have no concern. Like, if you want me to launch on a 1-hour diatribe about Justin Trudeau or Mark Carney or whatever, I have no concern that I know I would not suffer any blowback whatsoever. But by doing this podcast, I know I kind of have to make the decision that I can't go to the States anymore, at least not for the foreseeable future. And there are many people within the jiu-jitsu community that I've talked to who have straight up said, and like big names in the sport, who have straight up said they'd love to talk about stuff like this and they'd love to come on Fighting Matters, but they're pretty sure it would result in the end of their career in jiu-jitsu because they couldn't travel anymore. And I think the folks in the States and the folks within the jiu-jitsu community really need to think about what that means and what the implication is and what freedom of speech really means. And because I think they might be losing it much more quickly than they think they are. But anyway, that's my outsider's perspective.
Yep. Agreed.
I think if I had to sum it up with my fundamental belief of all this, one of my favorite authors of all time is Kurt Vonnegut. And his quote that always sticks with me is like, "God damn it, be kind." Like, if everyone just fucking be kind. And I think that takes away a lot of this conflict, you know?
Yeah,
and I know that's idealist, but I think that like it's a mantra I repeat in my head: just be kind, you know?
Yep. Well said, man. Well, do you want people to follow you and ask you questions, or do you want to just disappear onto the internet quietly?
I don't know. That's a loaded question.
This is the part where I always tell people if they want to, drop their Instagram or somewhere where people can ask them questions. We can promote that.
How about I do this? No, I'm not going to drop my Instagram because all my Instagram is of pictures of my kids and my dog. Which, as a Newfoundlander, I have a 175-pound Newfoundland, so he's the majority of my photos. But if anybody, we post this online, post this on YouTube. If anybody wants to ask questions, I'll jump on there and respond the best I can.
Awesome. All right, hit them up in the comments then. Thanks a lot, man. Jesse, if people want to find you, where can they find you, sir?
You can always find me in Louisville, Kentucky at Rough Hands BJJ, and on socials, Rough Hands BJJ. Come see us. We love visitors.
Amazing, guys. And of course, I'm at bjjmentalmodels.com. Appreciate it, everyone. I'm glad we got to do this. I think this is kind of a cool conversation, not talked enough about the sport, or in our sport in jiu-jitsu. So hopefully this answers questions for people. I had a lot of fun in any event. So thank you all.
It was great. Thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks all. Take care.